My name's Narelle Hooper. I'm chairing the next session, and I'm delighted that you've crammed in here on such a beautiful sunny day. And speaking of dangerous ideas and important questions, what happens after the luck is the topic of our discussion for the next hour. And our guest speaker is Miriam Lyons. And just briefly, just to set the scene, Australia, we know, had a massive mining boom since 2003. Now, we've shifted into the next phase of that. We didn't make the most of it. And what happens now? Other sectors have wound down. We need to do some things differently. So I'm hoping we can get your input for this discussion. Miriam Lyons has been asking a number of dangerous questions, very powerful questions. She's a policy analyst and writer and commentator, and co-founder and executive director of the Centre for Policy Development, and it's a public interest think tank. She's been a regular guest on the ABC shows Q&A, The Drum. She's contributed to several media outlets. She's also co-edited several books. Now, there's a bit of a theme going on here, you can tell. Pushing Our Luck was the first one. More Than Luck was the second one. Today, the talk is After Luck. Now, her earlier roles have included being as the editor at New Matilda, researching freedom of speech in East Timor and organising ideas festivals, which is where you get this great kind of fulmination of discussion. The genesis for this topic, though, today was chapter 11 of her latest book, which she co-wrote with Ian McAuley, and that's a book on Governomics, on the role that governments can and should play in shaping a country's economic structure. So Miriam's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to take some time to come together and have some questions. So I'm really looking forward to your input. So would you put your hands together and please welcome Miriam Lyons, please.
Thanks so much, Narelle. Sorry, I really should point out, it keeps on turning back up in my bio, but I'm no longer the executive director of the Centre for Policy Development. But that was my past, kind of full-time paid gig.
You were.
I was. Look, so I'm just delighted that the Sydney Opera House has invited me here to talk about the apocalypse and why we should welcome it. It's great. End of the world, I'm in favour, lots of fire. I'm a bit of a pyro, love seeing falling rocks from the sky, utterly excellent. Sorry, wrong speech. Right, so end of the mining boom. I've got good news and I've got bad news. The bad news is the party is over and the hangover is kicking in. It was a fun party while it lasted, at least for those who got the invite, but Australia's once-in-a-lifetime mining investment boom is behind us and we pretty much pissed it up against a wall. Now, the good news is the end of the boom is not the end of the world. The only thing that is standing between us and a lastingly livable Australia is a small cohort of politicians and lobby groups who are so short-sighted that they treated a temporary boom as if it were a permanent bonanza. Seriously, we can think rings around these guys. I have absolute confidence that the people in this room and across the country can overcome the obstacles lying between us and a future where our work is more satisfying, our leisure more abundant, our incomes more secure, our air cleaner, soils healthier, climate safer, cities more livable, and our regions more resilient. We can do this. But first, let's just take a closer look at what it means to live with a mining boom here and around the world. I'm going to kick off with Nauru. When Nauru gained independence in 1968, its people had the highest per capita incomes in the world. It's a tiny island state with only 8 square miles of land, but it was sitting on one of the world's richest sources of phosphate. Generations of birds had gifted the island with their nutrient-rich droppings. First the colonists, then the locals became rapidly and exceedingly wealthy by digging up the ground beneath their feet. Now it's among the poorest countries in the world. A history of exploitation, including by us, left Nauru with few economic choices, and its sources of revenue are now so rare that it makes headlines when it finds a new one, from selling passports and laundering dodgy money to hosting companies like Transfield, which profit from punishing refugees on Australia's behalf. Nauru's population grew sick on a diet of imported processed food, with some of the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in the world. And having sacrificed their best farmland to mining, that's a situation they're finding hard to reverse. Former President Marcus Stephen has described his home as an indispensable cautionary tale about life in a place with hard ecological limits. On the other side of the world, Norway chanced upon a resource that could make its people rich. Norway's reaction to its discovery of North Sea oil in the 1960s is often cited as a really great example of how a country can make its good luck last. Norway, it basically treats companies like the plumber, the mining companies that come and extract its oil. They're there to do a difficult and a dirty job. They need enough money to do that, but nobody is confused about who owns the resources. Norway taxes petroleum firms at a rate of around 78%. It puts the proceeds into a sovereign wealth fund, which is kind of like a trust fund for citizens, and it has around $900 billion under management now. That fund owns almost 1% of the world's stocks. Now, Australia is a bit fond of a flutter. We've turned a horse race into a de facto national holiday, and we commemorate our armed forces' unluckiest day in the First World War with games of two-up, a two-pennied salute to the gods of chance. Australia has undoubtedly benefited from the resources lying under the land that we nicked from its original inhabitants, but we have not yet been as successful as Norway in transforming our minerals into a legacy that we can all share. We may have been better at making our luck last than Nauru, but our leaders are still playing dice with destiny. Judging by the policies of the current federal government, it is betting that the mining investment boom will make a surprise comeback, that the housing bubbles in Sydney and Melbourne will never burst, that the global momentum for action on climate change will dissolve, and Australia will escape the extreme weather that follows if it does. Now, just to be crystal clear, because I know I'm going to get asked this, I am not suggesting that Australia hasn't benefited materially from the boom or that managing the end of it will be easy. Instead, I'm making two main points. Firstly, over the long term, we, by which I mean the majority of Australians both in and outside the mining sector, as opposed to the small number of individuals and firms who own mines, would have benefited more from a slower boom, with higher mining taxes and a sovereign wealth fund to help insulate the rest of Australia's economy from the impact of mining investment on the dollar. A slower boom could have a lot of benefits. For one thing, there is no need to put up with the social and environmental side effects of ripping the bowels out of the earth with frenzied speed. This is a lesson that we should learn from and act on now so that we're better prepared when the price of iron ore and other resources rises once again. Secondly, we need to imagine Australia's place in a coal-free world. Thermal coal may be entering a structural decline. The price of cleaner alternatives is dropping rapidly, and more countries are taking action on climate change. A carbon-constrained world means less demand for our fossil fuels. We should be talking now about how to deal with that instead of trying to just kind of put our hands over our eyes and pretend it isn't happening. Now, anybody still read the newspapers here? Hands, newspapers, yes, excellent, up the back. Go guys, Murdoch is grateful. No, did anybody see the front pages of the front pages of the papers this week talking about how Australia's economy is doing right now? Latest GDP growth figures, anyone? Yeah, how'd you feel? Can I get a call out? I think someone has said happy. Look, I think now is the point. For those who didn't hear that, the woman in the second row from the front just said she's really glad that Australia is open for business and good government is succeeding. Given the state of the economy right at this minute, it kind of seems like an appropriate moment to ask whether it is better to have boomed and bust than never to have boomed at all. The investment phase of the mining boom was a mixed blessing. It was often exaggerated, it was partly offset by its costs, and it was never going to be permanent. But there is no denying that it delivered a major boost to growth, to investment, to national income during a very difficult decade for the global economy. The main problem is that we dealt with its benefits wastefully and its side effects blindly, and we failed to plan for its inevitable end. So just a quick recap, and I'm really sorry folks, this bit's going to involve graphs. At its peak in 2013, mining investment made up almost 8% of Australia's gross domestic product. That contributed to growth as well as to overall economic confidence. On the other hand, because the sector is 80% foreign owned, most of the profits head straight back offshore. All of the investment that you're seeing there did come with jobs, mostly very well paid ones. Not nearly as many jobs, though, as we tend to assume, and it did also lead to job losses in other areas. Many people find it hard to believe that a sector that so dominates our front pages employs only 2% of the workforce, 2.4% at its peak. A survey by the Australia Institute a few years back found that most of us think that mining employs 9 times more workers than it does. Mining has always been a capital-intensive industry, heavy on machinery and light on people, and it's getting more so over time. Now, because the mining workforce is so small, the main benefit to most working Australians came via increased purchasing power. In other words, a whole bunch of things from clothes to cars, from laptops to international holidays got cheaper in real terms. Probably all remembered, looking with glee at, the price of things that you could order on Amazon during that time. So researchers at the Reserve Bank looked at what a stronger dollar meant for people's hip pockets. And, basically it adds up to real money. Real per capita disposable income was boosted by around 13% compared to what it would have been without the boom. Now, of course, that boost was not all evenly distributed. We can talk about that a bit more later. And if you look at the timing of the peak in this graph, you'll notice that Australia's current economic hassles have been brewing under the surface for a while now. Now, it has been argued that we wisely squirreled away a lot of that extra cash, given that the household savings rate increased. I wonder whether that's the whole story, particularly in light of this graph from a recent presentation by the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, who warned that increased land prices are not the same thing as increased wealth. He pointed out that, as far as we know, Australia didn't actually create any more land during that time. So, does saving really count as saving if it's inflating a housing bubble? The federal government also screwed up on this front, with the Howard and Rudd governments responding to a temporary revenue spike with the permanent income tax cuts. Not only were these cuts unfairly distributed, disproportionately benefiting the rich, they also explain a large part of the structural deficit in Australia's budget today. When the tide goes out, you can see who's been swimming naked. We also did not collect as much revenue from mining companies as we could or should have. I won't revisit the mining tax debate now, except to say that the outcome of it was that we allowed a handful of companies making windfall profits to tell us that they will decide the prices they pay us for our resources in this country and the circumstances under which they pay them. And not only do we fail to charge enough when we sell off the family silver, we often go further and subsidise those who bundle it up and carry it away. Finally, there's the problem of what a high dollar does to other trade-exposed sectors, otherwise known as the Dutch disease, or the Gregory effect if you're particularly geeky. A higher dollar is great if you're buying a new TV or taking an overseas holiday, but it's a bit bad if you're running a local tourism business or studying at a university subsidised by full fee-paying international students. It's also bad if you're attempting to compete with cheap imports in agriculture or manufacturing, especially if you have to compete with mining employers who can afford to pay higher wages. And this may help explain why employment in those industries went down quite dramatically in the mining boom states of WA and Queensland. Over time, successive resource price spikes tend to ratchet up our dependence on the resource sector while hollowing out every other sector that exports. The result is that a mining boom can be kind of like a Midas curse for the broader economy. Everything that it touches turns to coal. Now, speaking of coal, I've got some bad news for Tony Abbott. Coal is not good for humanity, nor is it a solid foundation for our prosperity. Also, there's no Santa Claus. Look, while that may be disappointing news for Tony Abbott, it's unlikely to surprise the 20,000 coal mining workers who have already been sacked since coal jobs peaked at 60,000 a few years ago. And the people in the towns who are affected by this deserve our support, like all the other people out of work in a country where there are 5 job seekers for every vacancy. They should be treated with respect, they should be given practical help, and they should not be blamed for their bad luck. The precariousness of coal as a source of prosperity is also unlikely to surprise the owners of the existing mines, who might be secretly hoping that the president of Kiribati's call for a moratorium on new coal mines succeeds. Right now, restricting supply is about the only thing that might rescue their share prices. Possibly should have thought of that before they produced so much of it that it drove the price down in the first place, but hey, that's how the commodity cycle works. This delightful fixer-upper is called Isaac Plains. It's a coal mine in Queensland, and it was sold last month or in July, I think. Can I get people in the audience, does anybody want to guess how much this mine sold for? $1 sold to a whole bunch of people towards the front of the audience. Well done. Now, I'm singling coal out here, and particularly thermal coal, because there's good evidence that it's entering what experts call a secular decline. In other words, economically, it's an ex-parrot. Not resting, not pining for the fjords. In fact, incidentally, the fjords aren't pining for coal either. You remember the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund that I mentioned earlier? Divested from coal this year. In the words of US banking giant Citigroup, on the demand side, we think thermal coal is cyclically and structurally challenged and that current market conditions are likely to persist. Now, Australia's economy is actually in a pretty good position to deal with this. The biggest impact is on export revenue, and at the moment, thermal coal is just 5% of our exports. Coal's slice of GDP is also pretty small. It's around 1.4%. In terms of employment, we're looking at about 0.3% of our workforce, or about the same as our motion picture and sound recording industry. There's quite a few reasons that we should expect coal to go the way of whale oil as a fuel source. For starters, coal kills people, and not just a few people. An estimated 800,000 people a year die early from the health impacts of burning coal. In China alone, there are around 670,000 deaths a year from air pollution, with coal being one of the major culprits. Just going to play you guys a little scene. Oh, hang on. Play you guys a little scene from a movie now. I think the guys out the back of the stage might do something magic any moment now so that we can watch a tiny little scene from a wildly popular documentary called Under the Dome. Let's see.
真正的星星吗？
没有，
你见过蓝颜色的天吗？
见过蓝一点的，
你见过白云吗？
没有。
Now, that doco came out, I think, earlier this year. It was downloaded 200 million times in its first week. This is a really big motivating factor for everything that China is currently doing to try and cap its coal use. Just last week, China passed changes to its anti-pollution laws, including new powers to punish offenders and a legal framework for capping the consumption of coal, which is the biggest source of the smog that was blocking that girl's view of the sky. Secondly, we may not be taking climate change very seriously, but our key trading partners are. The raw numbers are that 80% of fossil fuels need to stay in the ground if we're to head off climate change. Or, as the Australia Institute's Richard Dennis put it, if the world wants to tackle climate change and Australia wants to double its coal exports, somebody is going to lose. This image here shows us how much more fossil fuel the world could burn while still having a halfway decent chance of keeping warming under 2 degrees, which in itself is a pretty risky target. Now, that little grey circle on the left, that's our remaining carbon budget for the whole planet. The big circles on the right, they show carbon dioxide tied up in the world's known reserves of coal, gas and oil. And I look at that image and I think, okay, let's be optimistic. I'm pretty optimistic. I'd like to give, the human civilization as we know it even odds of not being suicidal. So let's assume that the world manages to stick within the budget. Oil, gas, coking coal, which is used to make steel, they are all going to be way ahead of coal-fired power in the queue to take up space in that tiny little circle on the left. Also, turns out people quite like renewable energy. Might be something to do with the whole not killing people or turning the sky brown thing, I don't know. Good marketing ploy. The price of most renewables has come down much faster than anyone expected, and they're winning the race with fossil fuels for new investment. On top of this, energy use is starting to go backwards in the developed world. Now, in this context, did try and find a picture of Tony Abbott to stick on that, ran out of time. In this context, describing coal as the foundation of prosperity is the equivalent of talking up the future of the horse and cart industry just as the first Fords roll off the lines. Can I just do a quick time check here? How are we going? 20 minutes. We're going to talk for ages, guys. This is going to be great. Does anybody know the story of Kodak? The fact that Kodak actually had somebody who invented the digital photography on their staff, and then kind of forgot about that, and was a little bit worried about it undermining the core business of film-based photography, and then went bankrupt in 2012. And there's something about Australia's early pioneering role in solar technology and what we've done since then that just rings bells. It rings bells. Everyone knows at least a little bit of Donald Horne's lucky country quote, right? Incidentally, anybody here from Newcastle? Hey, right. The Lucky Country pub? I sometimes like to think that the good residents of Newcastle have Donald Horne in mind when they leave the RY off the end of the country. So here's the whole quote. Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas, and although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders so lack curiosity about events that surround them that they are often taken by surprise. Remind you of anyone, any governments you might be aware of? Look, we know this, right? A boom based on non-renewable resources, by definition, is not going to last. It's not going to be permanent. But in politics, the word permanent can have a slightly different definition. It can be something like until after the other mob gets in. So, where to now? First, Stop attempting to perform CPR on the thermal coal sector. In the Monty Python School of Industry Policy, it wouldn't boom if you put 4 million volts through it. Second, let's start planning now and acting now for the next boom. The price for iron ore and other mineral ores will go up again at some point. I don't see what the rush is. We're heading towards a global population of 9 or 10 billion people. A lot of them are going to want wind turbines, laptops, railway lines. There is absolutely no reason to flog our remaining minerals off like the last wheelless pram at the end of a long garage sale. You know, the thing you wake up in the morning and you're putting on your garage sale, and first you bargain really hard with the people who turn up at 6 a.m. super keen to get all of your bargains, and then later on you're starting to get a little bit more flexible with the prices, and at the end of the day you're like, please, I'll give you free beer if you take all of this extra stuff away and save me another trip to Vinnie's. We're acting a little bit like this with our mineral resources, and I just don't get it. Despite any threats that some of you may have made after the last federal election, Australia's population is not going to get up en masse and move to New Zealand. We're not going anywhere. We don't have to have a moving sale. Now, I have a theory. This might be a controversial theory, but let me try it out on you. Now that the prices are low again, it could be a good time to reintroduce the idea of a profits-based nationwide mining tax. Now, this is a strange thought, right? But bear with me for a moment. The Minerals Council of Australia originally supported the idea of a profits-based resource rent tax. It's the kind of design for mining taxation that means it goes harder on miners during boom times and softer on miners during the downturns when prices are low. Now that prices are low, given how short-sighted they were when prices were high, maybe they'll be equally short-sighted now and go, great, all right, we'll support this scheme because, it means less tax right now at this minute. Just a thought. To make everything a bit simpler to understand this time, we could extend the 40% petroleum resource rent tax that currently applies to oil and gas projects so that it covers coal and minerals as well. If that slows the next boom down, good. It might have fewer side effects. Third, it's time to get a bit serious about government's role in shaping the economy. Now, forget the line about governments being bad at picking winners. It's usually trotted out by people who are perfectly happy to go on backing losers. There's the uncontroversial stuff, like upping investment in education and training, in research and development, in transport infrastructure. The International Monetary Fund, one of its recommendations of what Australia should be doing right now is have more publicly funded investment in the kind of infrastructure that Australia is going to need. That would be a great way to soak up some of the spare capacity that's now going unused after the end of the investment boom. This is a really sensible idea. Having a great infrastructure Prime Minister might be a good start. How about we build a real national broadband network? Okay, maybe that one's a bit contentious. I also think that we need governments to roll up their sleeves and help entire sectors, and in some cases individual firms, to anticipate and to adjust to new trends and new opportunities. Now, there are obviously better and worse ways of doing this. Giving in for decades when global car makers, some of the world's most successful standover merchants, turn up to governments cap in hand with the politely worded equivalent of your money or the jobs get it. That's not great industry policy. Bad idea. The federal government's new diversification fund, which is helping car part suppliers retool to make other things, pretty good idea, I reckon. So far, so good. Quick good news story on this front. Heliostat South Australia, SA, are former suppliers to the auto industry who have gone solar. They received assistance from the Diversification Fund to form an alliance with the CSIRO to make parts for concentrated solar thermal power projects, using the same pressed metal equipment that they previously used for making car parts. What if we could have a similar diversification fund for manufacturers that supply the mining industry? Now, in the words of physicist Niels Bohr, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. We can't know for certain that another boom or a return of the boom isn't just around the corner. Maybe increased volume will compensate for lower prices. Maybe coal will get so laughably cheap that people start ignoring its downsides again. What we do know is that thanks to Dutch disease, we have one of the least diverse export profiles of any developed country in the world. It's the 5th least diverse after the end of the mining boom. Thermal coal is only 5% of our exports, but coking coal is 7%, and iron ore is a much bigger deal at 20%. Now, that kind of, all of the eggs in the one export basket strategy, it is risky, and it's not inevitable. We know that commodity markets are inherently volatile, and they're also getting more so. This is some research that the Centre for Policy, some research that the Centre for Policy Development did a little while back, pointing out that resource volatility has tripled over the past 30 years or so. Now, that's something that makes life particularly difficult for exporters who are in other sectors, right? So as long as Australia's exports are dominated by a couple of resources shipped to a single region of the world, the Australian dollar will be volatile as well, which will keep making life difficult for businesses in every other exporting sector. It's quite hard to plan ahead in that context, right? So we are starting to see some signs of life in some of the other non-mining exporting sectors now, but they're not bouncing back nearly as quickly as we like. And there's a lot of evidence that firms who are exporting, they face one-off costs, right, for establishing themselves in global supply chains. So you can't just assume, you can't just lie back and think of Karratha during a boom and hope that everything will be fine in the morning. We also know that competing on costs, which is what commodity exporters tend to have to do, that it's hard to add that much extra value to a lump of coal. There's some other things that we do. Australia's quite good on the reliability side, a few other things, but competing on costs tends to have unpleasant side effects for workers and for the environment. Competing on value would be way more fun for everyone. And this is why I think that the usual solutions that are trotted out about what we should do right now, a whole lot of them are in that let's compete on cost mindset. Let's smash any unions that we can find that are left. Let's see what we can do, to privatise a few more things and deregulate a few more other things. Not fun for us. You don't want to win a race to the bottom. So that's the last graph for today, promise. Incidentally, is anybody coming to Dennis Glover's talk this afternoon, Winners and Losers? Hello. I'll see you there. We can keep talking. So he'll be talking about his new book, An Economy is Not a Society. It's kind of an obvious point, but it's very easy to forget. It's always important to recognise that numbers that look good on paper may not be so great on the ground. And speaking of that, I would really like to have you introduced to this guy, Gadrian Hoosen, and again, the magical people behind the black curtain are going to do something that makes the video play.
My name is Adrian Hoosen. I'm from Borroloola, that's in the Gulf, the Carpentaria, right in the pocket of the Gulf, and I'm from the Gadawa tribe. The biggest major problem that we have in our community is mining. MacArthur Mine has got a mining lease, and all that poison should stay into the mining lease. They had no right to contaminate the river where we live downstream. That's why we're standing here fighting hard for our river and our country. That river was our livelihood. We fished off that river for many years. And our people did fish there for a long, long time, many years. Mining not going to last, isn't going to last forever. That's why we fighting hard together. We need to try to find a way in our community, find a job for people to get in the community, a job that can last for a lifetime and work in a clean environment.
So when people like Gadrian Hussein first raised concerns that runoff from the MacArthur mine was poisoning the fish in their rivers, Glencore ex strata said, it's fine. But an independent report, partly compiled from the mine's own records, found unsafe amounts of lead in 9 out of every 10 fish caught in a nearby creek. This is in the mine's first offence a couple of years back. 28,000 litres of diesel just leaked into the soil before people spotted a pipe that was busted. Incidentally, if you want to find out more about what these guys are working for and calling for, I've just sorted this morning that they've got a new petition up on change.org, so maybe head there and see if you can Google it. Look, it's not like the whole issue of contaminated land and water from mining is a new problem. Lead and copper mines from the Roman Empire were still poisoning the Spanish waters in the Tinto region. Name's not a coincidence, by the way, Rio Tinto, tainted waters, over 1,000 years later. Now, Gadrian pointed out that the people in his community could do a great job of cleaning up the mess that MacArthur Mine has made in their area if the company would stump up the cash for it. Sounds like a pretty good idea to me. In fact, Australia has a whole lot of damaged and contaminated mining land. It's quite dangerous to leave these massive big holes in the ground, right? Land is a funny thing, you know? It's perfectly healthy if you just kind of leave it to do its own thing. Dig masses of it up, turn it upside down, particularly ore-rich areas, and all of a sudden it turns into poison. We have a whole bunch of holes in the ground. They're not just holes. They're actually, essentially toxic dumps. Now, if we made mining firms pay big enough bonds to cover the costs of rehabilitation, which we're not doing at the moment, then the rehabilitation of that mining land would also potentially be a great way to employ skilled miners and their equipment during the downturns between booms. Look, I think there's a bit of a bigger question here, which I'm hoping we can get into during discussion. What is an economy for? In fact, what is Australia for? We're some of the richest people, not just in the world, but in the history of human civilization. It is just ridiculous to think that we can't solve our biggest problems if we put our minds to it. And then what? Imagine an Australia where the way that we live from day to day is closer to the way we want to live from year to year, where the sustainable choice, the choice that leaves the river clean, the fish safe, the land healthy, that leaves other sectors of the economy flourishing, is the default choice, where every single one of us gets to go to work in the morning in confidence that we'll have created more value than we've destroyed at the end of our hard-working day. Now, surely anything else is a waste of human talent and ingenuity. So I just want to finish with, one kind of simple question. What if we could learn how to be good ancestors?
Thanks, Miriam. A number of themes through that. So we've got the issue about corporate social responsibility, we've got government policy and investment and education and so forth. And I'm struck by that question, what if we could become good ancestors? And I'm still thinking of some aspects on that. But when you describe, given the environment that we've grown up in business and how the whole business model works, it strikes me just that last comment of yours, an environment where the fish is safe, the land's healthy, and people head off to work knowing that when they come home they're going to leave the
world a better place at the end of the day.
Place. Yeah. Now I'm struck by the movie The Castle and Daryl Kerrigan where he says, "Tell them they're dreaming." Is it even possible?
Well, I think it's
given
possible.
the way we operate.
Yeah. I mean, surely something that is more in tune with what we know about the fundamentals of human nature and human psychology, surely it should be possible for humans to create systems that reflect what they most deeply desire, right? You know, that's at the kind of most basic level. At the more kind of pragmatic level, you know, I realise that, you know, Australian politics is particularly toxic in this era, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that, say, acceptance of climate science is divided along left-right lines. You know, personally, I mean, thanks for everybody who came along today, because Naomi Klein's talk was sold out. Thanks, guys. But, you know, I should say that I actually agree with Naomi that our obsession with small government, our obsession with handing over more and more power to unfettered corporations is one of the biggest things that's blocking action on climate change. But I also agree with her when she says that to change everything, we need everyone. And I think you know, we can draw a little bit of inspiration from the fact that it was a former minister in the Thatcher government. And by the way, Thatcher did accept the science on climate change. Former minister in the Thatcher government, Lord Debon, who described the latest emissions targets from Australia as pathetically low. You know, it was... in Victoria at the moment, the Victorian Liberals are looking at, you know, marketing to investors their green power. They're looking at having a real focus on electric vehicles. So it kind of seems like they maybe didn't get invited to the kind of anti-environmental Liberal Kool-Aid drinking party. WA, the Premier has just said that he thinks that the future of their electricity sector is going to be based on renewables. So, I mean, there's a few different kind of signs of hope here, I think, in terms of the kind of political doability of this. Also, I mean, if you think that a sovereign wealth fund is some kind of pinko Scandinavian idea, actually Alaska has one too, and it hands out free money to its citizens every year.
Yeah. So I'm moving to
This is
Alaska.
possible.
Not. So let's move to that environment that you described. You know, to deal so low carbon development, more sustainable approaches to business. What if you ruled Australia? Where would you start with this?
Oh, God.
So if you were in Tony Abbott's
No one should rule Australia.
All right, if you were the wise guide who was in charge of the country at a particular time,
Oh, God, it sounds
where would you
horrible.
start? So
look,
after the luck, what's your recipe for creating the new luck?
You know, my philosophy on this is that we need a mix of national level, top-down, sensible policies, and we need bottom-up, creative, ground-driven policies. And, you know, like ideally what you want is for those to meet in the middle in a mutually supportive way. If we don't have the sensible top-down stuff, and some of that's like the obvious stuff that I mentioned earlier, you know, like that we should be spending more on transport infrastructure, we should be dealing with the legacy of urban design that means that so much of us get stuck in traffic for so many hours of every day, which is a big drain on productivity, on the ability to do more constructive things with our time. You know, there's a big project there that we could do that would actually have significant economic benefits. You know, there's a whole bunch of, you know, quite practical things to do with, you know, providing just a little bit of support. It doesn't necessarily need to be hugely expensive to help companies across all sectors to access the latest research on, you know, how they can essentially compete on value rather than costs, as I was saying earlier. You know, so that's some stuff that you can have governments doing. You know, sometimes that's better done at a federal level. Sometimes it's better done at a state level. Yeah. So, you know, if everything's all screwed up at one level, we can still look at hope for positive change somewhere else. The other thing was I really wanted to play a video that I did with a woman I came across this week called Amanda Carl from the Centre for Social Change in Queensland. But unfortunately, I did it on my iPhone and it doesn't work on there. But we were having a great conversation about the work that she's doing, where she's been getting called into communities. She basically does economic development work, economic development consultancy. She's been getting called into communities that have had coal or that are potentially about to get coal by people saying, can you help us think of a future beyond coal? Because, it's kind of hard for us to see that at the moment. Where are the jobs going to come from? And so all that she does is go in, she talks to, counsellors, to business people, to people in the community, and says, okay, what are the resources that you have? And in the process of that conversation, people start thinking, actually, there are other things that we can do. We have fishing, we have tourism, we have not just international tourism, but grey nomads. We have student backpackers. We have a whole lot of things that we can do with vocational education and training. There's a whole lot of different things that you can do with the resources that exist in the community that can provide you that sustainable economic renewal from the ground up. Another thing that I find quite inspiring is the work that a guy called Governomics does, which is again going into a very local economic scale, talking to people about what are the wastes within a community that can be turned into resources. So this is that whole kind of industrial ecology concept, because the fact is, it's not just coal that has a limited future. It's the most obvious one now, but in the long run, resources are limited. We live on a finite planet, and there is so much potential value. We could have so much more flourishing economy that was actually nicer to live with in a lot of ways if we learned how essentially just to bring it within ecological limits, right? To have different types of products be made in a way that they're designed to be reused. They're designed to be pulled apart and remade again. They're designed for that kind of low energy footprint.
So Gunter Pauli is, from memory, the blue economy?
That's
that?
Yeah,
so he decided that the green tinge was too divisive. So he came up with the whole blue economy approach. The other one that struck me was the circular economy.
Yeah.
Which is...
very sexy phrase now. The World Economic Forum has a project on the circular economy. Yeah.
So,
hey, can we get these guys to ask questions as well?
I'm just about to. I was about to finish with that point.
Sorry.
And then, so what Miriam would like to do is to give you a couple of minutes to actually talk to the person next to you. Have I got this right?
Yeah.
Yep. And then we'd like to see if there's a great question that comes out of that we can put and have a discussion about. So do we want maybe just have a little bit of light so people can see each other? Is that...
So we'll give you 1 minute. Talk to the person next to.
Yeah.
If you think the person next to you has a fantastic question, I want you to encourage them to get up and ask it.
That's true. And if you're on your own, can you find someone? and join in the group next to you. So if you're sitting alone and you would like to talk to someone else, just join in. And then we've got the microphones there and there. All right. So if you can, we'll draw you back now.
Excellent. The conversation after this is finished is just going to be so good, I can tell.
So we've got the microphone down the front. I really hate to interrupt you there.
And I really want to encourage any women in the audience to stand up and ask a question.
No,
doesn't mean the men can't ask. I'm just giving extra encouragement to women to jump up, get to the front of the queue.
Thank you. So we've got microphone number 1 here. So if you could come down there and please identify yourself. Please keep your questions short if you could, and so we can get through as many and have a good conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so first I need to say that I workshopped this question with my daughter, okay?
Great move.
I'm a great keen reader of Ross Gittins, and for the last couple of years he's been advocating the idea we live in a society, we don't live in an economy, which is very much in keeping with the theme. So where do we change our focus in either the universities or the economists that are reporting on the economy versus society? Where do we take? How do we change?
God, that's a great question. God, I wish I knew. So for years at the Centre for Policy Development, we did research on, essentially the kind of mainstream economic arguments in favour of ideas that are inherently good, right? And pointing out all of the cases in which a very strong, very credible economic argument is on the same side as arguments for putting people and the planet first. I think that's quite a useful thing to do in a society where, we do keep on mistaking GDP, which was never intended to be a measure of progress, as a measure of progress. I think it's useful to highlight those cases in which the strong economic arguments and the strong social arguments are on the same side. But more broadly, fundamentally, it's really clear. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of society. Society is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. I think that we just need to have more of these kinds of conversations where we think about, okay, what is the activity that we can do that sustains us, that meets those basic human needs, the need for shelter, the need for entertainment, the need for inspiration, the need for food, the need for clothing. If we refocus, because I don't think we should stop talking about those things, and those things are economic things. So I don't necessarily think that people who care about, a more caring society should have to talk about how we get there without ever mentioning any economic issues. I do, however, think that there is something that we should think about the kind of the focus of the conversation. I'm not sure if I kind of complied with this advice or this idea in the talk that I just gave, but there is a whole lot of psychological research that shows that essentially if you prime people to think about money, if you prime people to think about loss of money or financial loss, they become less compassionate, right? These are the kind of field-tested psych surveys. Even if you show people like a picture of $1 before they're going into some kind of test situation, they then act less compassionate in that test situation. That's a weird and disturbing kind of factor. So I do think that. I don't know, money, right? It's a collective hallucination. It doesn't exist except that we put value into it, like justice. So why don't we spend more time thinking about the collective hallucination of justice and less time thinking about the collective hallucination of money?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Phil Bradley with Parramatta Climate Action Network, promoting an international climate march on the 27th and 29th of November this year. Look forward to that.
Thank you for your
unsolicited
plug.
See you there.
The IMF estimated this year Australian taxes will subsidise the dirty fossil fuel industry about $41 billion. Why is it that we can't see the clear logic of reinvesting that into clean renewable energy and the greater number of jobs that will generate than are in the dirty fossil fuel industry? And why has the Australian public been fooled into believing we can have endless economic growth and wasteful throughput of our limited resources when everybody knows it's obvious we live on a finite planet?
Thank you.
Great questions. Okay, try and be quick on this one. So why are we still subsidising mining? Well, the lobby is quite powerful. While the mining may only represent 2% of employment, it has 15% of lobbyists on the federal lobbying register. So its outsized spending, I think, helps to create that kind of Dutch disease of the mind in Australia. And I think, we are in danger of seeing crony capitalism as well. I think we have a form of crony capitalism actually in Australia now. And let me be really clear, doing what the federal government is doing what some of the state governments are doing in backing mining over other industries, that's not free market. That's not neoliberalism. Okay, that's rewarding mates and punishing people who are not your mates. You know, if you genuinely were a true economic liberal believer, you'd be in favour of decentralised renewable energy because it can make markets a whole lot more competitive in that sector. And some people do recognise that. You do have, I think, people, you know, particularly in the Western Australian and Tasmanian governments who recognise that. Also, forget his name, one of the energy guys here in the New South Wales government does understand that. Often governments forget that in the face of very, very noisy influence from vested interests. The other thing, the question about, you know, when will we wake up to the limits to material growth? I should say I'm not sure that it's that necessary or useful to point to. I think it's very important that we recognise that GDP growth is not progress. But fixing climate change, bringing the economy within natural limits, we actually don't know whether that would increase or decrease GDP growth over the long term, right? You know, these things are incredibly unpredictable. And, you know, if you look at the scale and speed of change that is necessary to fix climate change, according to what the scientists are telling us, what we're looking at is a very, very fast mass mobilisation with very, you know, like with whole-scale retooling of a whole bunch of activity, a whole bunch of sectors. All of that normally clocks up as economic growth. You know, we could be looking at the equivalent of transformation that we saw in World War II when, you know, a whole bunch of the Allies actively invested in retooling their economies. And during that time, growth was higher. And consumption was controlled, but health went up. People got healthier during that time. So you know, I think there are different ways of thinking about that. Thanks.
Hi there. My name is Lycia Heath, and I'm here as a concerned citizen and voter, I guess, no other reason. My question is about policy. You have an extensive background in policy. I don't seem to be able to rely on my government or modern government anywhere in terms of policy, and I'm genuinely interested in why there is a lack of policy generation within politics now. I don't want to romanticise the past of politics because there's a lot of bad, but there used to be policy frameworks and policy engineers within politics, and there seems to be a massive void on that front now, and they rely more on external providers, think tanks, IPA, whatever that happens to be, to feed policy back. And citizens can be concerned about policy, but unless that void within politics is filled, a lot of it can be for naught. So I'm very interested in your comments on the lack of policy within politics.
Thank you.
Great question. Great question.
We brought the audience in specially for you today.
You guys are awesome. Yeah, look, so, I mean, I should say that, yes, fundamentally exciting new policy agendas tend not to come from within parties these days. They tend to come from external sources. Sometimes they are coming from the public service. The public service is still doing a whole lot of great policy development, often gets ignored. You know, I think we need to, one of the points that we make in Governomics is that we need to let public servants spend more time serving the public and less time covering their minister's arse. That would be a good sign of progress. But there's a kind of big kind of structural change going on in politics in most Western democracies, let's call them, where they're becoming kind of very hyper-managed, professionalised marketing exercises. And I think part of that is because the kind of traditional parties, you look at Labor and Liberal, if you look at the Democrats and Republicans, they've kind of lost their natural, like a big natural constituency as a voting bloc. So, you know, we have seen the kind of the fragmentation of social groups break down, partly as a result of the success of past progressive policies, right? So, you know, we grew the middle class, and by growing the middle class, we had less of a big block of oppressed workers to vote en masse in favour of policies that would support their interests as opposed to those of their employers. And, you know, in response to the loss of, you know, any one easily tied up natural constituency, what you have is politicians going around and kind of trying to piece a governing coalition of voters, some of whom care, some of whom don't, to build their way into an election. So that's kind of the challenge for all of us now, is to find new ways of building quite often creative alliances across different social groups on different issues. And I think that's quite often why you see more new policy agendas coming from outside of kind of mainstream politics than you used to.
So we're getting a bit tight for time, so if you could keep your question tight and your answer, unfortunately.
My name's Nancy Olson, and I'm also at this stage just a concerned citizen and kind of flailing around looking for what I can do to change some things. You said a lot of things that I suspect most of us already partly knew, mostly agreed with, some wonderful suggestions, some things about a conversation. My real question, though, is these things are floating around, but the decision makers aren't listening to them. Sometimes they don't even see the problem. How do we, people, us, make the decision makers see the problem and influence them to make some changes? The changes that you're suggesting are wonderful, but a conversation won't take it. We need something practical.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. Activism. No, seriously. Australia did not get as good as it is now. I know we've left a bunch of people behind, but Australia did not get, a universal healthcare system. It did not get some of the highest minimum wages in the world. It did not get to this point without activism. It wasn't an accident. That can take many different forms. If marching in the street waving banners is not your thing, there are so many other options. But basically,
such as?
Okay.
Give me two.
Organising.
So
pop onto getup.org.au. There's a whole bunch of different things you can check out. Get involved in local community groups that are running local campaigns, whether that's for stuff that's good or against stuff that's bad. There's the Transition Towns movement, which gives people a good avenue into that. I think that we should have a longer conversation about this when it's finished. But basically, if anybody actually wants to write me an email saying, hey, I want tips of how to get involved, I'm not quite sure how to help out, totally happy to write back and brainstorm some ideas.
Great.
For what it's worth, I did try that with our federal local member who said GetUp's a Labour stooge organisation and wouldn't talk to us.
You always know you're doing something right when everybody thinks you're a stooge for multiple different parties.
Yes. Okay, look, we've got a bit over a minute left, so if you could cut to the chase. Thanks.
So a lot of the changes you're talking about are going to be coming from the universities and I'm 22, so from my generation. And when we studied the GFC, they said a lot of the problems from that came from the Harvard Business School and that mode of teaching. So would you say that the universities in Australia right now are approaching this in a way to enable my generation to make those decisions, or do you think they're teaching older methods?
That's a great question. It depends on the university. So I'm going to make some enemies now. The Australian National University's economics department is pretty notorious for having the kind of rusted on old school neoclassical model that doesn't have that much room for alternate ways of thinking about the world. I'm not saying there's not good people in there or that good students haven't come from there. But I think that Australia could benefit from an extra dose of global student movement in economics that's happening right now, to have just essentially more pluralist teaching of economics. There's a website for it. I'll stick it up on that link that I put up earlier, miriamlyons.org. I'll put the link to that up there if you want to check it out.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. UTS also is doing great.
Absolutely.
There is some good work going on in
UTS Business School particularly has great ideas.
Look, I'm really conscious we've started the conversation here and now we've got to wrap up. I'd urge you to go out, get together, see what you can do.
I'm doing book signings now, I think, somewhere. So they've got half an hour for that. You don't have to buy a book, just come up and have a chat.
All right. So, look, thank you, Miriam. I think you're a champion in with chasing these ideas, and we need to change things up very quickly. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to joining you for the rest of the day also. So please put your hands together for Miriam.